The Italians knew that the British were coming after them. They knew it all too well, but the thought of backing down was humiliating. If they went the easy way, the Germans would mock them. The Regia Marina had to prove to the Kriegsmarine that it could handle itself in combat. What the Italian sailors did not know, however, was that the British had read the Italian Naval Enigma and were following their every move. Then, at 8:12 a.m. on March 28, 1941, Admiral Angelo Iachino's task force spotted several Royal Navy warships off Cape Matapan in Greece and went after them. Little did the Italians know that they were being lured into a lethal trap. In June of 1940, Adolf Hitler's highly disciplined and trained soldiers had the essence of an invisible army. The Blitzkrieg forces were sweeping through northern France, rendering the indomitable defenses of the Maginot Line useless and outsmarting the largest army in the world. Norway, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, and Poland had already faced the Germans, and many more nations would soon follow. Meanwhile, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was facing several dilemmas. He was a friend of Hitler's, but was still unsure about joining him to engage the Allied forces. Still, Italy had some pending matters to settle with England and France as far back as World War I. Mussolini had to decide between joining Germany to conquer new territories and extend Italy's influence, or to remain neutral and risk a surprise attack from the British that would come sooner or later. Time was pressing, and Italy had to do something. It all rested on El Duce's hands, and his fascination with recreating a new Roman army and empire ultimately prevailed. In joining Hitler in the conquest of France, he would become the new Caesar and go against the will of the king and the Pope. The dictator then dispatched the Regia Marina to take over the Mediterranean and make it the ancient Mare Nostrum of the Roman Empire once again. To fulfill such a promise, El Duce had been building a powerful navy starting in the early 1930s to act as a deterrent against the influence of the British and French in the region. However, the British had prepared for a possible Italian resurgence and even developed secret plans to bomb the main Italian docks and shipbuilding facilities if a confrontation broke out. While the Royal Navy was concentrated on protecting merchant convoys in the Atlantic from the feared German U-boats, the British left the Mediterranean unguarded with second-rate ships. In addition, the French fleet was out of the equation after the Reich negotiated peace with the Vichy government. Mussolini was now ready to go to war against the United Kingdom. Mussolini got more than he bargained for when he declared war on the United Kingdom and forgot to consult his naval officers about Italy's scarce oil for his Regia Marina. It was a mistake that he would continue to pay for months, as the British would be quick to cut off the Italians from its valuable oil fields in Libya. After some setbacks in Greece and North Africa, Mussolini called Germany for support. The result was the creation of the Africa Corps and the audacious Luftwaffe campaign in Crete. During these critical months, Mussolini also launched Operation Gaudo, a master plan to sweep the Royal Navy from the waters of Crete. Veteran officer Admiral Angelo Iachino was put in charge of the operation, which intended to demonstrate to the world that the Italian Navy was a worthy adversary. On March 26, 1941, the Regia Marina task force set sail for the first time since the highly damaging British attacks on the Italian fleet docket at Taranto. Morale was high among the Italians, but Admiral Iachino remained skeptical. The Luftwaffe had told him that they had sighted 2 British battleships that were severely damaged and easy prey for the Italian sailors. Iachino smelled a trap, but he was not certain. In reality, the allegedly damaged ships were in pristine condition and waiting for them, led by ruthless Admiral Sir Andrew B. Cunningham. Days before the Italian task force set sail, a cryptoanalyst at Bletchley Park cracked the Italian Naval Enigma for the first time and intercepted messages from the Italian Navy. The British then realized that the Regia Marina battle fleet ravaging merchant ships comprised 1 battleship, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 13 destroyers. Admiral Iachino's flagship was Vittorio Veneto, a Littorio-class battleship and Italy's most powerful vessel. With him were the Alpino, Granatiere, and Bersagliere destroyers from the 13th Flotilla, the Zara, Fiume, and Pola heavy cruisers from the 9th Flotilla, and the Luigi di Savoia Duca degli Abruzzi and Giuseppe Garibaldi light cruisers from the 16th. Although the Italian fleet was ready to wreak havoc in the Mediterranean, it lacked air support and, more importantly, radar. This made it highly vulnerable against a surprise attack or an air assault from an aircraft carrier. One day before the Italians set sail, Admiral Cunningham secretly got aboard his flagship, HMS Warspite, and began gathering his force to hunt down the Italians. His Mediterranean fleet consisted of the aircraft carrier HMS Formidable, 3 battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 17 destroyers. The Italians would be somewhat outnumbered and already at a disadvantage without air support. On March 27th, Vice Admiral Pridham Whipple set sail from the south of Crete to meet with Cunningham's force and prepare for the attack against the Italians. Meanwhile, Iachino's force steamed around the same area, hoping to catch any British merchant ship. Unfortunately for the Italians, no Axis aircraft made further reconnaissance flights over Alexandria to let them know that the British had just left the harbor to meet them at sea. Then, at 6:35 a.m. on March 28th, Iachino launched a small scout plane from Vittorio Veneto and spotted the British squadron. The Italian admiral knew there was no turning back. If the British were there, it was because they knew the Italians' location. Still, the Italian task force decided to engage and avenge the disaster at Taranto while showing the Germans their will to fight. At 7:55 a.m., Trento encountered Admiral Pridham Whipple's force south of the Greek island of Gavdos. Iachino then opened fire at 8:15 a.m. and went after them. After failing to catch up with the British and firing over 400 rounds that caused little damage to the enemy, the Italians broke the chase and regrouped. Meanwhile, the 7th Cruiser Squadron turned back and started to follow them. The colossal Vittorio Veneto waited for them to get within shooting range and fire at them. Veneto then fired over 90 accurate shots with an excessive dispersal of her salvos, resulting in light damage. When the rest of the British ships arrived at the scene with Cunningham, he immediately ordered an air attack. Fairey Albacore torpedo bombers left HMS Formidable at 9:38 a.m. and went directly for Veneto. Although the attack failed, the maneuvering broke off the Italian formation. Admiral Iachino then ordered his fleet to set course for the port of Taranto, where he could call in air support. However, at 3 p.m., Cunningham ordered another air attack. In the hellish firefight between the small albacores and the Italian guns, Lieutenant Commander John Dalyell Stead managed to approach Veneto and release a torpedo that hit her outer port. Dalyell Stead and his crew did not survive the counterattack. The damage was done. The torpedo had caused 4,000 long tons of flooding. Iachino stopped Veneto to perform repairs and adopted a defensive position while the British ships closed in. Then, an hour later, the formation began moving again at a speed of 35 kilometers per hour. Knowing the extent of the damage the British had caused, Cunningham ordered another violent air attack 2 hours later. At 7:30 p.m., a dozen albacores and Fairey Swordfish went after the capital ship once again. Iachino then ordered a 3-column formation and made use of smoke and searchlights to fight the aircraft. It worked, but a torpedo hit Pola, causing the ship to lose power. Her sister ships, Zara and Fiume, then approached to provide cover, while Veneto and the rest of the formation made way to Taranto. At 10 p.m., the British task force spotted Fiume, Zara, and Pola in the middle of the darkness. As the Italians lacked radar, they could only detect enemy ships visually. The British battleships immediately opened fire at a distance of 3,500 meters, and minutes later, Fiume and Zara were torn to pieces from all sides. As both ships began to sink, the Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci destroyers sailing nearby were also eliminated. Gioberti and Oriani managed to escape, albeit with heavy damage. The British tried to rescue as many sailors as they could before leaving the scene, and transmitted the location of the remaining sailors to the Italian High Command. Ultimately, they managed to save 1,020 survivors. The total Italian casualties amounted to over 2,300 sailors, most of them from Zara and Fiume. As for Vittorio Veneto, she managed to reach the base at Taranto with the rest of the surviving ships. The Italian Navy would not perform any other offensive operation for the rest of the war. In November of 2008, the Russians were overwhelmed by a devastating maritime tragedy less than a decade after the traumatic loss of the Kursk submarine in the Barents Sea. K-152 Nerpa, an Akula-class attack submarine, was conducting routine trials in the Pacific Ocean with a mixed military and civilian crew, when something suddenly went wrong. At 8:30 p.m., the fire control system was activated, and 2 forward compartments were sealed. Several crew members were now trapped inside, with a dwindling supply of oxygen, unable to escape, while others tried to make sense of the situation. Inexplicably, there was no fire to put out. In 1993, the Russian Akula-class submarine Nerpa K-152 was laid down at the Amur shipbuilding plant shipyard in Komsomolsk-on-Amur in the Russian Far East. The 8,140-ton nuclear-powered attack submarine, named after the Baikal Seal, belonged to the Soviet Project 971 type of fourth-generation submarines. However, her completion was delayed for nearly a decade due to the dire economic environment of the collapsing nation during the early 1990s. An anonymous worker at the shipyard once admitted that there were, quote, questions about the quality of the metal that was used in building the nuclear submarine. The unnamed source explained that a portion of the metal had been purchased from China. Moreover, he added that, quote, when the first trials of the submarine were carried out, water was leaking in between the seams, so it's not surprising that the work dragged on. The incomplete vessel was ultimately mothballed until the early 2000s. It was the Indian Navy that showed interest in the submarine, and an agreement was signed so that Rusbom, the Federal Agency for Industry, would finish the ship and lease it to India. Incidentally, some reports in the Indian media claim that the resumption of construction was indeed subsidized by Indian funds, and that in exchange, Nerpa would serve with the Indian Navy for a decade. Even so, several analysts sharply criticized the vessel's quality, as it had been below standard. For one, defense editor of the Ejidnevny Journal newspaper, Alexander Goltz, noted that in the 1980s, the Amur shipyard delivered submarines, quote, one after another, like pancakes. Then, between 1993 and 2008, the plant barely produced a single vessel, and as it later turned out, the lone underwhelming submarine would eventually pay a high cost. The submarine was expected to be completed no later than 2007. Alas, that didn't happen. That year, Nerpa was transferred to the Vostok shipyard in the closed city of Bolshoi Kamen, Primorsky Krai, to be fitted out. Finally, after 15 years of extenuating development, the submarine was launched in late 2008. However, before being delivered to the Indian Navy, the vessel would have to undergo sea trials and be handed over to the Russian Defense Ministry. Russia had a $2 billion agreement with the Indian government that included the leasing of Nerpa and another submarine, but the deal would be unexpectedly postponed. Indian naval crews had been training to operate the Russian vessel as part of India's crucial nuclear submarine program known as the Arihant class. Some had received training near St. Petersburg, while another group of sailors would arrive in Vladivostok in late 2008 to carry out sea trials. That November, Nerpa was undergoing sea trials at the Russian Pacific Fleet's test range in the Peter the Great Gulf by the Sea of Japan. The vessel was yet to be commissioned by the Russian Navy, and was merely undergoing plant tests under the supervision of a team from the Amur shipyard. For the trial, the vessel had a complement that far exceeded the regular crew. Other than the 81 military personnel that boarded the submarine that day, 127 civilian engineers from different shipyards responsible for either the building or the outfitting were also partaking in the exercise. Nerpa's first underwater test run was launched on November 8th, but at 8:30 p.m., something went wrong. Suddenly, the ship's fire extinguishing system was triggered, and the security system sealed 2 forward compartments, filling them with a noxious substance. Several sailors were now trapped, with no way out. Fire has always been a constant hazard when it comes to submarines. Each compartment of a Russian submarine contained an LOKH station, or a volumetric chemical fire suppression system. If necessary, the fire extinguishing gas could be released into the same compartment or the adjacent ones. Freon R114B2 gas, or dibromotetrafluoroethane, better known as cladone in Russian, was not an unknown substance for the nation's navy, which regularly employed it as a haloalkane refrigerant. When the gas was released into a given compartment, it would quickly displace oxygen, chemically interfering with combustion. As such, the non-flammable gas would occupy the space inside the enclosed rooms, thus extinguishing the fire and preventing it from spreading throughout the ship. In high concentrations, R114B2 can cause narcosis, eventually creating mental confusion and lethargy, but in extreme cases, it causes asphyxiation. Regrettably, the sailors on board Nerpa were caught completely off guard. The warning sirens only sounded after the gas had already poured in, and 3 military personnel and 17 civilians lost their lives in the accident. In addition, no less than 41 people were injured, several of whom were employed by the Amurski shipbuilding company. Many of them suffered from frostbite, as the gas has a chilling effect. Immediately after the accident, the Udaloy-class destroyer Admiral Tributz and rescue vessel Sayani rushed to the scene from the nearest city, Vladivostok, to assess the stricken crew. The injured sailors were transferred to the destroyer and hastily sent to military hospitals for appropriate treatment. In the meantime, the undamaged submarine returned to Primorsky Krai on her own, but a question remained unanswered. No one knew what had set off the fire control system. The terrible news shocked the people of Vladivostok, and the incident was described as the most gruesome submarine disaster since Kursk sank in 2000. At first, the cause of the accident was attributed to the LOKH suppression system, whose newer version had not yet been tested on any Russian submarine. Earlier versions could only operate manually from the duty shift console, but the new system could work automatically in response to smoke and temperature rises in the environment. These speculations were not unfounded, as attested by an engineer from the Zvezda shipyard who confirmed the system had already malfunctioned when Nerpa was being readied for the sea trials. Indeed, many analysts speculated that the system could have been activated accidentally due to an equipment failure. On November 10th, the Russian Navy publicly blamed the disaster on an unsanctioned operation of the fire suppression system, claiming that the system had activated without any human intervention. However, the truth emerged a few days later. As naval investigators looked deeper into the case, they discovered that it had been a crewman who had turned the system on, quote, without permission or any particular grounds. The seaman, unofficially addressed as Dmitry Grobov, believed the local control unit was not connected and started playing with the system out of boredom. Under normal circumstances, the local control units would be protected by a 5-digit access code. However, the access combinations were penciled on the units for the sea trials. As such, the crew member increased the readings from 30 degrees Celsius to 78, causing the computer to believe there was a fire on board and activating the otherwise appropriate protocol. Whether or not Grobov was aware of what he was doing, he was charged and faced up to 7 years in prison, but the sailor was acquitted by a jury following an earlier not guilty verdict in 2011. That verdict was overruled by the Supreme Court's Military Board in 2012, and a retrial in the spring of 2013 confirmed the decree. Even so, several colleagues expressed skepticism about Grobov's culpability, attesting to his experience and specialty as a skilled crewman. Moreover, a number of untamed retired naval officers told the Kommersant newspaper that it was doubtful the seaman was solely responsible. They explained that no one person could activate the system because it required multiple levels of confirmation. Nevertheless, the terrible outcome could also be blamed on a simple fact. There were many civilians on the submarine at the time of the accident. Igor Kordin, a former submarine commander, noted that civilian observers would be highly untrained to respond appropriately to emergencies. It was explained that the release of the firefighting agent had to be preceded by a specific light and a sound signal that alerted the crew, after which they had to put on oxygen masks that would grant them 30 more minutes while the compartments ventilated. Moreover, it was likely that many passengers were asleep and unable to don the emergency equipment. This was confirmed by later reports, indicating that some of the victims could not turn on the breathing kits before they suffocated. Even so, while the potential for such accidental discharges is not uncommon in the Russian Navy, they seldom result in fatalities, and the irony of a safety measure attacking the very crew it's meant to protect was not lost on the authorities. Lieutenant Dan Daspit was exuberant. The skipper was in command of USS Tinosa, which was on her second war patrol in late July of 1943. The submarine had been lurking the Japanese shipping routes from Borneo to Truk for a couple of weeks, and the crew finally spotted a thin trail of gray funnel smoke on the horizon. It was the Japanese tanker Tonanmaru No. 3. Tinosa then apprehended her prey while submerged and fired 4 textbook shots. All the torpedoes ran true, and the crew eagerly waited to hear the unmistakable sound of the explosions. The expectations behind the Mark 14 torpedoes were enormous, as they were deemed the most advanced anti-ship weapons in the U.S. inventory. A few seconds later, the sonar men heard the projectile thumps striking the tanker's hull, and then the unexpected happened. The U.S. Navy had a perfectly serviceable torpedo in World War I, the Mark 10. But as the decades passed and the world set the stage for the largest war in history, the decent self-propelled mine fell behind in the arms race against the stronger and faster ships of the 1930s. Moreover, as the design of submarines advanced, the need for a larger, faster, and more powerful torpedo soon arose. Design work for the Mark 14 torpedoes started in 1931 with the clear intention to innovate torpedo designs and create a new kind of explosive that could pierce through the recently developed underwater naval armors. As such, the developers drew inspiration from the 1920s German concept of magnetic mines and focused on perfecting under-keel detonation. Although the idea might seem obvious in hindsight, it was groundbreaking in the interwar period. Still, the advanced concept brought along many problems. To begin with, previous torpedo models detonated on contact, so an explosive traveling below keel depth would fail to explode. Still, a state-of-the-art invention seemed to offer an unerring solution. The Mark 6 exploder was a detonator conveniently activated by the charge in the magnetic field provoked by the ferrous metals in the ship's hulls and bowels. The torpedo carried a moderate warhead that allowed it to detonate under the influence of a steel hull as it passed beneath it. Notably, there was no armor on a ship's belly. The remarkable technology was treated as top secret and concealed from the public eye. Furthermore, the manual with the details of the exact inner workings of the extraordinary Mark 14 torpedo was locked away from anyone who would use the technology. Needless to say, the supposedly original mechanism was a decade old, and many other countries were already experimenting with similar approaches. Still, the Sea Service's paranoia and stubbornness in the pre-war years would ripple through the early stages of the war, unwittingly affecting the people who relied on their navy the most: sailors and submariners. As USS Tinosa encountered the tanker Tonanmaru No. 3 on July 24, 1943, and fired a few Mark 14 torpedoes at her to no avail, the Japanese vessel turned and steamed away. Frustrated, Tinosa's commander, Lieutenant Dan Daspit, chased after her. The pursuit was long and exhausting, extending through the night until Tinosa was in a position to launch an attack again. This time, her torpedo man closely checked every piece to ensure the torpedoes were working smoothly. Only then did the submarine fire. Both mines hit the target, and as a muted rumble echoed through Tinosa's hull, her crew cheered. The tanker was forced to stop after being hit in the engine room. But Daspit, a seasoned skipper, took his time to approach his enemy's port side. He used to carefully launch one torpedo at a time at an exact angle of 90 degrees like he was trained to do. At 1,000 yards, the commander thought only 2 or 3 of his Mark 14 torpedoes would blast the tanker's hull and send her to the bottom. It was already the morning when Tinosa fired the next torpedo. The shot was perfect, and the mine ran true. Still, nothing happened. Unconcerned, the crew proceeded to make another shot. But there was no eruption, or even a single noise. The desperate commander then fired another 2 torpedoes, but they did nothing. One torpedo only managed to raise a plume of white water, while the other struck the tanker and broached the hull, only to sink afterward. By now, the Japanese crew was well aware of the Americans' presence. The multiple failed attempts had given them plenty of time to make a distress call. Soon, a destroyer came to their aid, much to the disgust of the confused submariners, who, after launching the last 2 torpedoes to no effect, were compelled to leave the scene. The tables had turned. On their way home to Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Daspit wrote an entry in his log, reading, quote, "I find it hard to convince myself that I saw this. It was simply unexplainable that 13 out of 15 torpedoes had failed to detonate, especially considering that most shots were textbook launches. Returning with empty hands, Daspit met with Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, the new commander of Submarine's Pacific Fleet, or ComSub-PAC. The irritated skipper then retold the story of the uncanny encounter with the Japanese as Lockwood listened attentively. Lockwood later wrote, quote, "I expected a torrent of cuss words, damning me, the Bureau of Ordnance, the Newport Torpedo Station, and the base torpedo shop. I couldn't have blamed him. 18,000-ton tankers don't grow on trees. I think Dan was so furious as to be practically speechless." The single unused torpedo in the submarine was later examined at the submarine-based torpedo ship and found in perfect condition. Still, Daspit's report was not the only problematic one within the submarine fleet, but it was the most recent and extreme case Lockwood had heard. Going back to a week after the attack on the Hawaiian harbor early on in the war, USS Seawolf had engaged a Japanese freighter near the Philippines, but only 1 out of 8 launched Mark 14s hit the target, and it failed to explode. Despite being considered a marvel of engineering, the development brought a litany of complications. Just in the first months of the war, U.S. submarines fired no less than 97 torpedoes at enemy ships, but only 3 were sunk. The Mark 14 was primarily designed by engineers at the Navy Bureau of Ordnance and built at the Newport Torpedo Station. But as the 1930s rolled on and the demand for more ammunition increased, the manufacturer could not keep up with production. While the Navy expected a rate of 50 torpedoes daily, the actual amount was not even half at its most productive. In truth, the production had a backlog of thousands of torpedoes by the end of the decade, rendering those few completed ones inestimably valuable in the war effort. Additionally, each piece cost as much as 5 times a new automobile, upward of $10,000. Unsurprisingly, the Navy was unwilling to lose even one torpedo on a live fire test. As such, the torpedo was cleared to enter service with almost no evidence supporting that it was as efficient as was thought. Only one test of the Mark 6 detonator was conducted, with poor results. Of 2 torpedoes fired at a derelict submarine, one ran under the target and did not explode, while the other did explode and sank the vessel. Ironically, the magnetic warhead was highly sensitive and prone to detonate with minor fluctuations, but the developers ignored that the ship's magnetic field was not the only one to influence the mines. In fact, the Earth's magnetic field played a key role, but having tested the projectile in a specific latitude that was different from that of the war zone, it was rendered useless. Still, the Mark 14 became the American submarine fleet's best chance at undermining Japanese shipping, even as it had a 50% failure rate. When the first complaints came, the Bureau of Ordnance bluntly denied any issues with their product. Even worse, they blamed the sailors and submariners for being incompetent. However, many projectiles missed their target, even when aimed with care. Some failed to explode, while others blew up before reaching the objective. But for all the attempts, the Bureau of Ordnance would not allow anyone to tamper with its precious Mark 14, or even get a glimpse of the operating manual. To further complicate the matter, the Navy eventually demanded a larger warhead, which was enlarged to 680 pounds, more than enough to pierce through the hardest hull. But the magnetic exploder worked too well, almost blowing up the skippers' faces. And despite having a backup contact detonator, it was never used. Moreover, the heaviest warhead caused the torpedo to dive too deep, seldom getting near the hull. By the time the Bureau of Ordnance acknowledged its mistakes and fixed the Mark 14, it was too late. Moreover, of the 53 U.S. submarines lost in the entire war, 20 were sunk before October of 1943. It will never be known if any were lost to faulty torpedoes, but what is clear is that dozens of patrols were wasted, hundreds of hands were lost, and many enemy targets were left to roam the seas untroubled. On the bright side, many other torpedo models benefited from the lessons learned with the Mark 14. And as Lockwood added, when the submarine commanders were finally able to hit the targets, quote, all major exploder problems suddenly disappeared. By late 1942, the snow squall had taken its toll on both sides, and combined with the smoke deployed by the British vessels to conceal a convoy of 15 merchant ships carrying fighters, bombers, tanks, and several resources, the battlefield had turned into a series of minor skirmishes with little to no visibility. If the convoy managed to deliver the goods to the Soviet port of Murmansk, there was a possibility the Soviet Union could survive the encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Still, German Vice Admiral Oskar Kummetz was trying his best to lure away the enemy's ships so that his second ambush force could attack from the south and lay waste to the rest of the convoy bound for the Soviet Union. As the second group of German destroyers finally arrived at the scene, it was only a matter of time before more British escorts appeared. The Germans had to act fast and sink the merchant ships before the hellish Arctic ambiance ruined their ambush operation. On December 22, 1942, Allied convoy JW-51B left from Loch Ewe, Scotland, bound for the Soviet port of Murmansk. The convoy was carrying vital supplies for the Soviet war effort. The Red Army was currently fighting the Axis forces across the vast frontier of the Soviet Union, and it was in dire need of food, ammunition, weapons, clothes, and transports to keep the hostile invaders at bay. Still, time was running out for the Soviet forces, and its numerically superior armed forces would not be able to resist for much longer. The emblematic cities that bore the names of the Soviet heroes of the October Revolution, Leningrad and Stalingrad, were under siege, and Stalin could not afford to lose them to the Wehrmacht. Convoy JW-51B comprised 15 transport ships that were carrying more than 80 fighters, 30 bombers, 200 armored vehicles, most of which were tanks, over 24,000 tons of fuel, and 55,000 tons of all sorts of supplies. However, making it safely through the Arctic was no easy endeavor, as German submarines operating in wolf packs made it difficult for convoys to survive the harsh and perilous journey. More importantly, other German surface vessels were constantly hunting for easy prey, and although the Kriegsmarine had turned more cautious after the loss of the Bismarck battleship, the surface fleet still posed a threat. Expecting not to suffer another loss as devastating as the attack on convoy PQ-17 early in the year, the British Royal Navy assembled a formidable escort for convoy JW-51B. The escort party was led by Captain Robert Sherbrooke and comprised 6 destroyers, 2 light cruisers, 2 corvettes, 2 trawlers, and 1 minesweeper. The accompanying destroyers were HMS Akaris, Oribe, Orwell, Obedient, Obdurate, and the flagship Onslow. They were joined by the Flower-class corvettes, HMS Rhododendron and Hyderabad, the trawlers Vizalma and Northern Gem, and the minesweeper HMS Bramble. Besides having the British warships, convoy JW-51B would benefit from the polar night, as it had sailed during the winter. This would help conceal the vessels, but it also worked against the British. Still, the journey to the Soviet Union had a rough start. The convoy was hit by a significant storm on December 28th, almost a week into the voyage. Furious winds scattered the ships, losing themselves in the dark seas and breaking the formation. Nightfall and snow squalls resulted in little to no visibility, further complicating regrouping. But thanks to the radar and the efforts of the minesweeper Bramble as she went after the stragglers, the convoy took form again. By the time the convoy linked up, Captain Robert Sherbrooke had realized the storm had pushed them further south and closer to the Germans stationed in Altenfjord. The captain was also advised by the Admiralty that an unusual level of German radioactivity across the Norwegian coast was detected. Fearing an upcoming attack, Sherbrooke ordered the escort ships to stay frosty and remain alert for anything unusual showing up on the horizon. The captain was right, and as the convoy made its way through the night, it was spotted by lone U-boat hunter 354. The fate of the Soviet Union now solely depended on what happened next. On December 30th, 1942, U-354 radioed the Kriegsmarine about having spotted the Allied convoy. As such, the German Navy began preparations for Operation Regenbogen almost immediately. The plan called for a one-of-a-kind ambush in which every available German capital ship in Norway would be dispatched to attack the Allied convoy bound for the Soviet Union. Vice Admiral Oskar Kummetz assembled the forces at Altenfjord and departed as soon as he could. They comprised the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, the pocket battleship Lutzow with its powerful 11-inch guns, and an escort of 6 destroyers: Friedrich Eckholt, Richard Beitzen, Theodor Riedel, Z-29, Z-30, and Z-31. The strategy envisioned by Kummetz was ambitious. The German ships would jointly depart from northern Norway and then separate into 2 equal groups to ambush the British convoy. Admiral Hipper's group would first attack from the north to attract the Royal Navy escort ships and draw them out. This would leave the merchant ships vulnerable to an attack from the south, in which the Lutzow group would swiftly destroy the unarmed vessels. The Allied convoy would be left defenseless and with no way out. If successful, the operation would compensate for Admiral Raeder's recent reverses at sea, especially after the loss of the Bismarck battleship and several pivotal German ships. Still, the plan was bold and could go wrong in many ways, significantly worrying the Führer. Adolf Hitler was simply unwilling to put Admiral Hipper and Lutzow at risk. As such, before departing from the base, Kummetz received a message stating, quote, "Procedure on meeting the enemy. Avoid a superior force. Otherwise, destroy, according to tactical situation." At approximately 8:30 a.m. on New Year's Eve, the lookouts from the Royal Navy corvette Hyderabad spotted 2 unidentified vessels on the horizon. Visibility was still low, with constant snowfall, and they could not be properly identified. The crew assumed they probably were friendly Soviet ships approaching to escort them. About 10 minutes later, the destroyer Obdurate saw a 3rd destroyer join the other 2, and at around 9:30 a.m., Obdurate steamed straight towards the ships after they failed to identify themselves. In the middle of the snowfall, Obdurate flashed a challenge with her lamp to confirm if the vessels were in fact Soviet. The response was not the one expected. The stillness of the night was interrupted by the flash of gunfire. The 3 German destroyers, Friedrich Eckholt, Richard Beitzen, and Z-29, had opened fire. Captain Sherbrooke's escort immediately went into battle mode and began laying down a smokescreen to conceal the movements of the merchant ships. Meanwhile, the British destroyers began engaging fire with their 4.7-inch guns against their 3 German counterparts. Soon, Admiral Hipper appeared on the horizon and steamed straight into the fray with her 4 8-inch twin gun turrets. The flagship Onslow almost collided with Hipper due to poor visibility from the smoke and the snow. Still, Sherbrooke moved forward and went into combat fearlessly. After severely damaging one of the British destroyers, Kummetz centered Hipper's guns on HMS Onslow. The British ships were overwhelmed, and they pulled back and made mock torpedo runs to force Hipper to keep her distance. The trick worked, and Kummetz and his crew fired blindly under the snow and smoke. Admiral Hipper then managed to land several hits on Akatis, with one of them hitting the ship's bridge and putting down most of the command crew. Still, the survivors kept laying the smokescreen until the ship capsized. Meanwhile, as the battle raged on, the trawler Sea Gem managed to rescue 81 crew members to protect the precious merchant ships. During Admiral Hipper's second run, she hit HMS Onslow 4 times. Shrapnel made its way to the bridge and left Captain Sherbrooke badly injured. Still, the ship and her captain kept fighting. But just as HMS Orwell was about to confront the pocket battleship, the cruisers Sheffield and Jamaica joined the fight to even the odds. The destroyers were part of Force R, a fleet positioned nearby to support the convoy in case it was attacked. At that moment, Kummetz knew the clock was ticking. The Lutzow group eventually arrived to join the fight, and a brief skirmish followed. However, the Germans failed to identify their targets. Destroyer Friedrich Eckholt put the minesweeper Bramble out of commission in less than 2 minutes, but the British also sent Eckholt to the depths of the ocean. Both ships went down with all their crews. Kummetz knew there was a high probability that he would be surrounded by incoming ships, and called to withdraw after Hipper was hit multiple times by the British destroyers. Ultimately, none of the British merchant ships were damaged, and they effectively made it to the Soviet Union to deliver their cargoes. Meanwhile, Hitler was enraged by the failure and blamed Admiral Raeder, ordering him to scrap all of the Kriegsmarine's 13 capital ships. Raeder opted to resign instead of following the order, which led to the appointment of Admiral Karl Dönitz as the new head of the German Navy. As a direct result of the failed ambush, Germany would not commit another capital ship for the rest of World War II, and the naval strategy focused on the U-boat fleet from then on. On May 8, 1945, Europe saw the end of a prolonged and gruesome war. However, peace had yet to come to all corners of the world. Far to the east, the war still raged in the Pacific, and the Japanese seemed unyielding, even when the Allies were slowly retaking one island at a time. Soon, the time came to plan a direct assault on the enemy's home islands. But drawing from previous experiences, the US foresaw the fighting would stretch into 1946. Before the secret atomic bomb was considered to subdue the Japanese, the US Navy devised a plan of classic coastal naval bombardments aimed at dismantling the nation's industry. Throughout July and August, the Allied fleets harassed many Japanese ports relentlessly, but they never expected how successful their attacks would be. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific had been costly for the US forces. But as 1944 came to an end, the Japanese expansion had been checked. In November, the Americans captured the Mariana Islands and secured several air bases to bomb mainland Japan. Meanwhile, the last Japanese Navy strongholds were wiped out at Leyte Gulf and off the Philippines, after many years of oppression for the people and the prisoners of war. Early the following year, US Marines assaulted Iwo Jima, which stood between the Marianas and Japan, ensuring yet another staging post for the bombers. The next step was to capture Okinawa, which gave way to an onslaught of shells, rockets, and bombs from no less than 1,300 ships, including the British Pacific Fleet. Even so, the Japanese staged a fierce defense against the 3,000 sorties of fighter bombers taking off from 40 aircraft carriers. In addition, 10 battleships and 9 cruisers pummeled the island with 13,000 shells. By April 1st, 4 US divisions landed on Okinawa, kicking off a bitter war of attrition for 486 square miles of land. The defenders were hidden underground, and it took the Americans 3 months to seize the entire territory. Although the Japanese counterattacked twice, their efforts were futile, and they eventually succumbed to the more powerful US military. Nevertheless, the operation required 170,000 US servicemen and cost 8,000 American lives. The end of the war was within reach, but the hardships endured at Okinawa now raised concerns about the feasibility of a direct attack on the Japanese home islands. US Navy planners advocated for a blockade and bombardment of Japan as a means to instigate its collapse. In turn, General Douglas MacArthur and the Army urged an early assault on Kyushu that would prepare the ground for a subsequent invasion of the main island of Honshu, and Admiral Chester Nimitz agreed with his Army counterpart. Thus came Operation Downfall, which would happen in 2 phases. First, Operation Olympic envisaged the main assault on Kyushu in early November. Operation Coronet would then focus on the invasion of Honshu in March of 1946. The casualty rate in Okinawa had amounted to 35%. As such, the force scheduled to partake in the assault on Kyushu rose to 767,000 troops. On the other hand, the Japanese High Command plotted a massive defense plan known as Ketsugo, or Operation Decisive, which would comprise roughly 3 million soldiers, with the sole purpose of breaking American morale. However, the US Army Air Forces punished cities and industrial facilities in the Japanese main islands with sustained attacks from the Marianas in mid-1945. Simultaneously, Allied submarines and surface ships cut most of the Japanese trade routes. Fuel shortages had also kept Imperial Japanese Navy ships from the seas, while the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service was forced to hold the remainder of its aircraft in reserve expecting a major Allied assault later that year. Furthermore, the Allied naval commanders decided to launch bombing attacks from their battleships against Japanese coastal cities to force the enemy to surrender before the atomic bombs were needed. On July 1st, the U.S. Third Fleet departed Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, led by Admiral William Halsey. Its purpose was to conduct a direct attack on the Japanese home islands. To prepare, the Navy first sent its submarines to Japan's inshore waters in search of naval mines. Simultaneously, the U.S. Army Air Forces deployed B-29 Superfortresses and B-24 Liberators to conduct photo reconnaissance sorties over Japan to identify airfields and facilities. Task Force 38 was assigned to execute the first strikes. Under the command of Vice Admiral John McCain, the task force launched its aircraft on July 10th and struck facilities around Tokyo. Task Force 38 then sailed north on the 14th to begin raiding Hokkaido and northern Honshu. Earlier in the war, these areas had been outside the range of U.S. bombers and had not been attacked. This was Japan's first naval bombardment in the better part of a century. The Americans met close to no opposition and easily sank 11 warships and 20 merchant ships. They also damaged another 8 warships and 21 merchant ships, and claimed to have destroyed at least 25 Japanese aircraft. Task Force 38 then detached a bombardment group, designated Task Unit 34.8.1, led by Rear Admiral John F. Shafroth Jr. The unit approached Kamaichi in northern Honshu, with the purpose of destroying the crucial ironworks, one of the largest in Japan. At 11 a.m., the battleship South Dakota hoisted a flag signal that read, "Never forget Pearl Harbor." It was expected that the Japanese defenses would respond to the bombardments with their aircraft held in reserve. However, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters had anticipated this moment and decided not to attack the naval forces in Japan to avoid exposing their last resources. In truth, they were awaiting a major landing operation. Around noon on the 14th, the task unit began bombarding the Japan Iron and Steel Corporation factory, which was the first Allied bombardment of a Japanese coastal town. Even so, they never crossed the 100-fathom line, as no minesweepers were available to clear the area. The force pummeled the factory with 802 410mm shells, 728 200mm shells, and 825 130mm shells. Most of the shells fell within Ironworks grounds, but the concussion from the explosion set the entire town ablaze. Despite the thick curtain of smoke that significantly impeded vision, the U.S. Navy fired accurately on predetermined targets, and yet there was no Japanese response. As Time magazine described, quote, "For 2 hours, the guns roared, and their shell bursts walked through the steel plant. The Jap reply from shore batteries was only a whispered echo. The sacred soil of Japan, from which the kamikaze, or divine wind, was supposed to disperse all attackers, had been violated." That same night, the attacks continued on Muroran, on the southeast coast of Hokkaido. Another bombardment unit, Tu-38.4.2, raided the Japan Steel Company's plant and the Wanishi Ironworks. Then, the following morning, 3 battleships battered the city, inflicting considerable damage to the industrial facilities and the urban structures. Accompanying his sailors from USS Missouri, Halsey acknowledged that his fleet was vulnerable to aerial attacks, and as he later remembered, those 6 hours were the longest of his life. Several more attacks continued smashing Japanese coastal towns through the end of July, effectively eliminating what was left of their navy. Still, an invasion of the home islands appeared necessary for the war to end. When the New York Times reported about the raids with more details than usual, it was a sign that Navy censors were now unafraid of Japanese military intelligence. On July 26th, the United States, Great Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Proclamation, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender, or else they would face, quote, the utter destruction of the Japanese homeland. After it seemed Japan had rejected the terms stated in the declaration, U.S. President Harry S. Truman and his advisors opted to deploy the first atomic bomb on the Japanese mainland. After the August 6 bombings of Hiroshima, the proud Japanese Empire still refused to surrender, and thus followed a second bombing on Nagasaki 3 days later. That same day, the Soviets invaded Manchuria, cornering the Japanese for good. On August 10th, the Emperor finally offered to surrender unconditionally under the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Through the last days of July and into early August, the Allied fleet was forced to stay away from Japanese coasts to avoid a typhoon and also replenish their fuel and ammunition stocks. The same day the second atomic bomb was dropped, the task force attacked a large concentration of aircraft in northern Honshu, and the pilots claimed to have destroyed no less than 720. Perhaps more importantly, the Allies were under the false impression that the ironworks at Kamaichi had not been damaged enough, and carried out a second bombardment on top of the city. New ships joined the effort, including heavy cruisers USS Boston and St. Paul, and half a dozen light cruisers and destroyers from the British and New Zealand navies. For 2 hours, the Allied fleet harassed the Japanese town, but they did encounter resistance this time. Even so, the effort was futile. Japan capitulated a day later, and after several negotiations, the Emperor surrendered on the 14th, officially ending the Pacific War and the last stage of World War II. James E. Williams knew that time was running out for him and his team. Their 2 patrol boats had been ambushed by more than 50 Viet Cong sampans at the Mekong Delta, and enemy fire was tearing the gunboats apart. Still, Williams kept his temper and ordered his men to do the impossible, race straight through the enemy formation to avoid being encircled. The crewmen from the Brown Water Navy doubted but trusted their captain and braced themselves to get close and personal with the enemy. They desperately needed helicopter support, but nobody knew if they'd arrive on time, or at all. Moments later, the 2 boats dashed across the area and faced their foes head-on. It was now or never, and they needed to throw away as many enemies and sampans as they could if they wanted to make it out alive. The term Brown Water Navy originated during the American Civil War in the 1860s. To cripple the economy and area of operations of the Confederate States, Union General Winfield Scott prepared the Anaconda Plan, which involved blocking the harbors of the southern states and then pushing along the Mississippi River with Union forces. To achieve this, General Scott worked with the Navy to establish a new river force of terrifying ironclads and gunboats that would ravage Confederate forts and cities along the Mississippi. These boats were referred to as the Brown Water Navy because of the river's muddy appearance. Brown Water Navy boats were briefly used in China during the 1920s and 1930s as part of the American Asiatic Fleet. These American gunboats or riverboats patrolled Chinese rivers to safeguard foreign interests in the region. Still, most of them were captured after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and none were deployed during World War II or the Korean War. They would have to wait until the outbreak of the Vietnam War in 1965 to make a comeback. During the first months of the Vietnam War, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps realized that taking control of the rivers that connected North and South Vietnam was vital. The North Vietnamese Army and their guerrilla, the Viet Cong, often used rivers to transport food, ammunition, weapons, and other supplies from one region to another without any American opposition. From simple sampans used by villagers to bigger boats, the enemy used these vessels to conceal supplies. Additionally, pirates and contrabandists infested river towns and cooperated with the communists. Consequently, on December 18, 1965, the United States Navy formally introduced the Brown Water Navy in Vietnam. The boats would be part of the River Patrol Force and the Mobile Riverine Force. Together, the U.S. Army and Navy would conduct joint operations to stop the flow of North Vietnamese troops, supplies, and communications into South Vietnam. The Army and Navy took inspiration from the Dinosaur or French riverine force coastal patrols of the First Indochina War. The mobile riverine force was tasked with not just fighting the enemy in the Vietnamese rivers, but also transporting soldiers, marines, and supplies to military outposts across Indochina. Also called the Riverines, their main base of operations was at Dong Tam Base Camp in the Mekong Delta River. Meanwhile, the River Patrol Force supported Task Force 116, a unit of 250 boats, most of which comprised the Patrol Boat Riverine Boat, or PBR. During the first months of 1966, the Brownwater Navy was composed of converted landing craft from World War II or modified small commercial boats. Still, the armed forces would quickly deliver authentic warboats with lethal equipment. The Army soldiers and Navy sailors that patrolled the rivers of Vietnam were tough men who fought at different combat fronts simultaneously. First and foremost, the men had to deal with the ambiance. Then there was the solitude. Once a boat made its way into inland waterways, they got little to no sun, and the sailors could only rely on their fellow boatmates. More importantly, there was the enemy, who knew the terrain well. The North Vietnamese were masters at blending with the jungles and forests, and like the many serpents found in Vietnam, they knew when to strike. River patrols were often attacked when they were most vulnerable, especially when patrol boat sailors stopped alongside Vietnamese sampans to check for contraband. The lightly armored boats were built for speed and constant movement, but lacked armored protection, and all types of grenades caused a lot of damage in the American ships. The most used gunboats were the Armored Troop Carrier, or ATC, the ASPB, and the Patrol Boat Riverine, or PBR. The PBR was the most used vehicle of them all, and was made of a small fiberglass hull and manned by a crew of 4. It saw action for the first time as part of Operation Game Warden in March of 1966 to deny the Viet Cong access to resources in the Mekong Delta. The small PBR patrol boat came in 2 variants, the Mark I and Mark II, the latter of which had a length of 12 feet, 1 foot longer than its predecessor. Both had a beam of 11.5 feet and a draft of 2 feet. The PBR displaced 14,600 pounds and was propelled by 2 jacuzzi water jet pumps, powered by 2 General Motors 220 horsepower diesel engines that resulted in speeds of over 20 and 30 knots. In addition, the boat was equipped with a Raytheon Pathfinder surface search radar and 2 AN/VRC-46 radios. In the hands of an able captain, the PBR was fast, highly maneuverable, and responsive. Offensive armament comprised a twin 50 caliber machine gun in a forward turret and a single 50 caliber MG located aft. Plus, a 40mm grenade launcher and an M60 machine gun were found on port and starboard amidships. The 31-foot fiberglass hull was resistant to torpedo worms and other marine borers found in the Vietnamese rivers. Still, it was not immune to shrapnel from RPGs and other explosives, but armor plates did protect the engines and the coxswain's flat. The 4-man crew comprised a boat captain, seaman, engine man, and gunner's mate, all of whom often carried M16s, shotguns, M79 grenade launchers, a Starlight night vision device, and a 60mm mortar. It was common to spot Navy lieutenants commanding river patrol operations across the Mekong. Such patrols often comprised 2 boats to face the enemies together. The soldiers and sailors were used to being overwhelmed and outnumbered by the North Vietnamese, but what they lacked in manpower, they made up for in firepower. Still, the PBR boats were highly vulnerable when they turned on their searchlights during night operations. The heroism of PBR crews was admirable. Historian and river water veteran Tom Cutler said that the PBR, quote, proved to be a fierce little combatant. The boats and the men who fought in them were truthfully characterized as proud, brave, and reliable. And Petty Officer First Class James E. Williams, in command of River Patrol Boat 105, was one of them. In May of 1966, Williams was assigned to the River Patrol Force and given command of PBR 105. Then, on October 31st, he was given a specific mission: to hunt down Viet Cong guerrillas located in an isolated sector of the Mekong Delta near Mai Tu. When PBR-105 and PBR-107 approached the area, the duo was greeted by small arms fire from a hostile sampan. Williams ordered them to return the fire, and they eliminated one of the enemy occupants. Still, the sampan fled to an adjacent smaller river, and they went after it. Little did they know that they were walking straight into a trap. As the two PBRs went after the damaged enemy sampan, they were greeted by a second one emerging from the waterway. The enemy sampan crew then opened fire with their AK-47 rifles and RPK machine guns, prompting a pursuit that quickly turned into a full-fledged combat encounter. Moments later, Williams ordered both boats to flee the waterway, but it was too late. A heavy volume of assault rifle and machine gun fire began pummeling the two American boats from well-concealed positions on both sides of the riverbanks. Williams then ordered his men to fire at will with everything they had. As the men fought their way out of the trap, the PBRs were confronted by more hostile Viet Cong, armed to the teeth aboard two junks. PBR-105 and PBR-107 were outnumbered and outgunned in a matter of minutes. And to make matters worse, over 8 other sampans showed up behind the two junks. Williams then got in the way of the hostile fire to help his men direct their mortar rounds and grenade launcher shots to where the enemy concentrated the most. He knew mobility was vital to survive the onslaught and made a shocking decision, calling his comrades to break through the enemy formation at top speed. The two patrol boats then crashed at high speed right through the Viet Cong formation, smashing some sampans along the way and sending enemy soldiers into the water. Soon after, Williams repositioned PBR-105 and 107 and continued firing 50 caliber rounds toward the enemies, who were still recovering from the Americans' unexpected maneuvers. Williams then called on air support through the radio as the crewmen continued firing their M16s and grenade launchers to decimate the approaching Viet Cong. However, it was going to take some time for the helicopters to arrive. Valuable time that Williams and his men lacked as they sighted an even more significant concentration of hostile enemy boats coming to encircle them. As Williams and his men were tearing apart the wooden sampans by the dozens, it was time to move out before they were entirely surrounded. Once again, PBR-105 and PBR-107 raced through the enemy boats, and they had a close call with an RPG round that damaged their hulls with shrapnel. Still, the boats were ready to go. Williams kept ordering his men to concentrate fire on the closest enemy boats to take them down more efficiently, which they did with devastating effect. As more than 50 enemy sampans started to sink, the Viet Cong casualties began to mount. Wounded and drained by the adrenaline, Williams and his crewmen kept firing until their main ammunition began to run dry. Soon, UH-1 Huey helicopters showed up to support the patrol boats, and the Hueys began to clean up the river with their M60s and rocket launchers. Williams and his men then returned to the ambush area to finish the surviving enemies. By then, night had fallen, and he ordered his men to turn the boat searchlights on to spot the Viet Cong. While the helicopters focused on the river craft, the two patrol boats got dangerously close to the shore to better illuminate the area and eliminate the enemies hiding there. The crewmen then engaged them with their M16s, combat shotguns, and their last mortar rounds. After 3 hours of relentless combat, the river ambush was finally over. The survivors had run away, and over 65 enemy boats had been destroyed, with over 1,000 enemy casualties. James E. Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor on May 14, 1968, for his courage and leadership shown during the October 1, 1966 patrol mission. Meanwhile, the Brown Water Navy and its brave Army and Navy crews would continue fighting across the rivers of Vietnam, and many patrol boats would become essential for delivering and extracting special forces, such as the Green Berets and MACV-SOG personnel, during classified operations as the war came to an end. The Battle of Drabuk Sound marked the end of the so-called Phony War and the beginning of World War II in Western Europe. On April 9, 1940, a German fleet led by the newly built cruiser Blücher approached Drabuk to begin the invasion of Norway. The area was one of the country's crucial points of naval defense, and the Germans intended to occupy the Norwegian capital of Oslo and capture King Haakon VII. But unbeknownst to the Germans, the nearby Oscarsburg fortress held a decades-old secret weapon, and their fleet was floating into a dangerous trap. After the devastating blitzkrieg attack on Poland in September of 1939, there was a months-long period known as the Phony War, in which only a few hostile military operations took place on the Western Front. However, Germany was planning to attack many European countries by early 1940, putting an end to it. Operation Weserübung was Germany's first direct attack on Denmark and Norway, and marked the beginning of the Norwegian campaign. The operation's first phase consisted of seizing the city of Oslo by air and sea and capturing King Haakon VII and his government. When the Nazi Party rejected the battleship limitations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, the Kriegsmarine began working on the Admiral Hipper class, a series of cruisers that would lead other ships into battle in their quest for world dominance. The cruiser Blücher was the second of this series, and the most powerful cruiser at the time of its construction. Named after Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, the Prussian winner of the Battle of Waterloo, the ship was completed in September of 1939 and pronounced ready for battle on April 5, 1940. The Blücher was immediately assigned to the Kriegsmarine Task Force that would attempt to invade Norway on April 9th. It would also serve as the flagship of Konteradmiral Oskar Kummetz, the commander of Group 5. The Blücher was filled with over 1,000 men, hundreds of whom belonged to the 163rd Infantry Division. This task force would take the city on foot. The ship was accompanied by a fellow heavy cruiser, the Lutzow, the light cruiser Emden, and other escort ships. As night fell on April 8th, the Blücher led the flotilla of warships into Drøbak Sound, the narrowest body of water en route to Oslo. The Narrows at Drøbak were a natural point of naval defense for Oslo. The area was guarded by the Oscarsburg Fortress, an aging military structure that had been relegated to train coastal artillery servicemen. The Nazis believed the fort did not pose a significant threat, but they were wrong. Unbeknownst to Kriegsmarine intelligence, when the Oscarsburg Fortress was put into service in 1901, a loaded torpedo battery was installed inside a cave near the area. The torpedoes were about 40 years old and built in Austria-Hungary. The battery was designed to launch its warheads under water level. It consisted of 3 torpedo tunnels that could fire up to 6 torpedoes without a reload, and 9 torpedoes were stored and ready to use. Each of the torpedoes carried a 220-pound TNT warhead. The targets could be spotted from 3 observation bunkers above the battery. By April of 1940, the commander of the torpedo battery of the fortress had been on sick leave for weeks. Retired Commander Captain Andreas Andersen had been reassigned as a temporary commander. Having first served at the torpedo battery in 1909, Andersen knew the aging weapons quite well. Oberst Birger Eriksson, the commander in charge of keeping a lookout for enemy ships, was surprised to spot an unidentified foreign fleet making its way past the outer fortifications in the south. Although tensions had been brewing throughout Europe, the 64-year-old colonel hadn't received any clear protocol about approaching warships. Norway was a neutral country, but it was clear that its government would side with the Allied forces if it came to be. As the mysterious flotilla continued its approach, Eriksson was warned by a Norwegian patrol boat that more ships were in the vicinity. The boat was then hit by a torpedo, and Eriksson alerted the men in the fortress of an incoming attack. Other than officers and non-commissioned personnel, almost all of the soldiers guarding the fortress were fresh recruits, having only been conscripted 1 week before. All of the fortress's lighthouses and navigation lights were lit out, rendering Oscarsburg Fortress nearly invisible. Commander Captain Andersen was then transported by boat over the fjord and to the torpedo battery. As Eriksson realized the magnitude of the attacking fleet, now just outside the fortress, he threw caution to the wind and ordered to fire upon the flagship. When his men questioned his judgment, citing Norway's supposed neutrality, he uttered, quote, "Either I will be decorated, or I will be court-martialed. Fire." Although the first shots from the mounted gun in the fortress missed the Blücher, the sound immediately alerted the Germans. As the Kriegsmarine fleet advanced deeper into the Narrows at 4 a.m, the Blücher's side hit the fortress's searchlights, making the cruiser visible. The Norwegian forces then fired, and the initial shell hit the cruiser on its port side and knocked the main rangefinder out of its alignment. The second shell made the most significant impact as it forced its way into the Blücher's aircraft hangar, striking its seaplanes directly. Nevertheless, the boat continued to advance through enemy fire, as the men in the fortress also attacked the accompanying vessels. Shots from the Blücher proved ineffective, as its guns were pointing too high and were unable to cause any damage. The fire in the Blücher continued to spread, and it uncovered a collection of explosives meant for the Oslo invasion. Amidst the darkness, the Kriegsmarine forces were still confused about the origins of the gunfire. A few minutes later, Commander Captain Andersen tore a massive hole in the side of the Blücher in an underwater 3-torpedo salvo. The strike hit the ship's boiler room and knocked out most of the ship's power, flooding it. As the attack finally seized on the cruiser, its crew still struggled to comprehend what had happened. The fire was out of control, and the ship became unable to move. The Blucher finally dropped its anchors at 4:50 a.m. as a sign of defeat. As the Blucher surrendered, an outburst of singing voices could be heard coming from the burning ship. The crew had started to sing Deutschlandlied, Germany's national anthem, and the Norwegians were now sure about the fleet's identity. The raging fire continued to spread and had ignited the ship's fuel store. The crew was ordered to abandon the cruiser, leaving hundreds of sailors swimming for their lives. Then oil started leaking, which then ignited more fire and injured hundreds more. At 6:22 a.m., the Blucher sank bow first into the depths of Drøbak Sound. It first laid on its port side, then turned upside down, and finally disappeared below the surface. Only a large stain of burning oil remained. About 1,000 Blucher survivors were eventually captured by the Norwegian Royal Guards, then moved to a nearby farm and placed under light guard without interrogation. Delaying the Nazi advance proved essential to the Norwegian royal family, the cabinet, the parliament, and the National Gold Reserve, as it allowed them to escape safely. Nevertheless, the Germans would soon launch the next phase of their operation. After the sinking of the Blucher, the enemy forces believed the ship had hit mines, and the remaining naval force retreated back down the fjord. The planned coup was then replaced by a land advance, and at 5:30 p.m. on April 9, 1940, German troops invaded Oslo. The following day, the enemy forces spread to the towns of Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik, and Oberst Eriksson was forced to surrender. Vidkun Quisling, a Norwegian military officer, politician, and known Nazi supporter, then stormed into a Norwegian radio station in Oslo and proclaimed himself the new prime minister. King Haakon VII was forced to appoint Quisling as head of the government to ensure a peaceful transition of power. But the king rejected, telling his advisors that he would rather abdicate than appoint a government headed by a Nazi sympathizer. The members of the government then unanimously voted to support King Haakon's stance and urged the Norwegians to continue fighting in the resistance. Without popular support, Hitler decided to create his own mixed government. Quisling served as Prime Minister of Norway during the war, heading the state administration jointly with German civilian administrator Josef Terboven. But after the war ended in May of 1945, Norwegian loyalists removed Quisling from power and arrested him and his aides for treason. The Battle of Drøbak Sound was a devastating loss for the Germans. It claimed approximately 800 lives, many of them highly decorated soldiers, specifically trained to storm Oslo's government buildings and capture the king, the cabinet, and the parliament. The Norwegians, on the other hand, suffered no casualties. The brand new Blucher was stopped in its tracks by an old fortress armed with decades-old weapons and a bunch of young soldiers who had just completed their basics of military training. The wreck of the Kriegsmarine cruiser still lies at the bottom of the Oslo fjord. In 2016, 75 years after its sinking, the area was designated an official war memorial to protect it from looters. In an era of clashing naval powers, the formidable Akagi emerged as a symbol of the Imperial Japanese Navy's prowess. She was transformed during times of innovation and uncertainty, boasting a colossal flight deck and 6 powerful 8-inch guns that set her apart from her contemporaries. Sailing the turbulent beginnings of the Pacific War, Akagi's presence left an indelible mark on history as a trailblazer in uncharted waters, paving the way for future carriers. However, the maritime behemoth faced a fateful mission that sealed her destiny. At Midway, a decisive battle loomed and threatened to alter the course of the war. In a harrowing turn of events, this pivotal confrontation would mark the beginning of the end for the fearsome Imperial Japanese Navy. Akagi was initially designed as a battlecruiser to fulfill the Imperial Japanese Navy's vision of creating a powerful fleet capable of projecting force across the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Still, this would change when the 1921 Washington Naval Conference Agreement imposed restrictions on the size and armament of capital ships, including battleships and battlecruisers like her. However, the treaty allowed for the conversion of 2 existing capital ship hulls into aircraft carriers, with a displacement limit of 33,000 tons each. Recognizing the potential of naval aviation and the strategic advantages of aircraft carriers, the Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, seized this opportunity and converted the unfinished hulls of Akagi and her sister ship, Amagi, into aircraft carriers. When Amagi was severely damaged in the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, Kaga, another battlecruiser hull, was chosen to replace her. The conversion of Akagi into an aircraft carrier was an ambitious undertaking, requiring extensive modifications to the ship's design. The result was a vessel that boasted a unique combination of features, reflecting its origins as a battlecruiser and the innovations of early naval aviation. Akagi measured 855 feet in length, with a beam of 102.7 feet and a draft of 28.5 feet. Her displacement when fully loaded was around 37,100 tons, just above the treaty limit. This large ship was powered by 19 Kampan boilers and 4 Gihan-geared turbines, which generated a total output of 131,200 shaft horsepower, enabling the carrier to reach a top speed of approximately 31.5 knots. While her original design featured 3 separate flight decks, with the upper and middle decks used for takeoffs and the lower deck for landings, a major modernization from 1935 to 1938 led to the lower 2 being eliminated. With a single flight deck able to accommodate more aircraft, she now wielded enormous power. Akagi's air wing was a formidable force, composed of a mix of Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, Aichi D3A Vi dive bombers, and Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bombers. The carrier's aircraft complement varied throughout its service life, but generally carried between 60 and 90 aircraft, incorporating both the design elements of a battlecruiser and the innovations of early aircraft carriers. Akagi emerged as a symbol of Japan's rising naval power. The vessel's early days with the Imperial Japanese Navy were filled with intensive training and exercises that molded her already disciplined crew into a well-oiled machine. After the refitting, Akagi became the first Japanese carrier with a large modern flight deck. Through operational experiences aboard the vessel, the IJN was able to forge its naval air power doctrine. As an aircraft carrier, its primary strength lay in its air wing, consisting of fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo bomber squadrons, allowing for different missions and increasing her strategic value. Early on December 7, 1941, sailing with 5 other carriers, Akagi began her attack by launching 2 waves of aircraft, meant to start a new stage in World War II. Descending on Pearl Harbor, the carrier's torpedo planes targeted the battleships USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, and USS California. Meanwhile, the dive bombers of the second wave attacked USS Maryland and USS Pennsylvania. Withdrawing after the attack, Akagi, her sister ship Kaga, and the rest of the carriers of the 5th Carrier Division moved south and supported the Japanese invasion of New Britain and the Bismarck Islands. After Pearl Harbor, Akagi continued to play a crucial role in the UN's operations in the early days of the Pacific War. In April 1942, the carrier took part in the Indian Ocean raid, targeting British naval assets and Allied shipping to disrupt supply lines to British forces in Asia and weaken the Royal Navy's presence there. Akagi and the 5th Air Fleet set their sights on the British naval base at Colombo, Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka. The raid resulted in the sinking of the cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Cornwall, along with several merchant vessels. On April 19th, while passing Formosa, now Taiwan, Akagi and the carriers Soryu and Hiryu were detached and ordered west to locate USS Hornet and USS Enterprise, which had just launched the Doolittle raid. Failing to find the Americans, they called off the pursuit and returned to Japanese land. A little over a month later, Akagi sailed in company with Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu to support the invasion of Midway. Little did her crew know that they were sailing toward a battle that would seal their ship's fate and change the course of history. On June 4th, approximately 290 miles from Midway Atoll in the North Pacific Ocean, the Japanese carriers began the Battle of Midway, launching a 108 warplane strike in what they hoped would be as successful as Pearl Harbor. Throughout the morning, the Japanese carriers evaded several attacks by Midway-based American bombers. Just before 9 a.m., Akagi recovered the Midway strike force and began preparing aircraft for an attack on the recently discovered American carrier forces. As preparations continued, American TBD Devastator torpedo bombers launched an assault upon the Japanese carriers. Repelled and suffering heavy losses caused by the fleet's combat air patrol, the American torpedo planes inadvertently pulled the Japanese fighters out of position. This move allowed the American SBD Dauntless dive bombers to strike with minimal aerial resistance. Akagi's unique design harbored an inherent weakness that became evident that day. Placed on the port and starboard sides, about 20 feet below the flight deck, the ship's guns could only target enemies on the side they were facing. Not only were her anti-aircraft weapons outdated and slow-firing, but they were also poorly positioned. Additionally, the island obstructed the portside guns, reducing their effectiveness. On June 4, 1942, at 10:26 a.m., Lieutenant Richard Best scored a shot on Akagi with a 1,000-pound bomb, which landed at the aft edge of the middle elevator, marking the beginning of the end for the once mighty aircraft carrier. The bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Best, penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, hurtling everything from men to aircraft over the flight deck's edge. With the hangars packed wingtip to wingtip with fueled aircraft carrying bombs and torpedoes, the Akagi fell into an uncontrollable disaster. Soon, Captain Tajiro Aoki ordered the carrier's magazines to be flooded. While the forward magazine flooded as intended, the aft did not, due to the damage sustained in the attack. Hindered by pump problems, damage control parties could not subdue the fire, and the vessel's situation worsened at 10:40 a.m. when the rudder jammed during evasive maneuvers. At 10:46 a.m., only 26 minutes after the initial attack, First Air Fleet Commander Vice Admiral Chiuchi Nagumo reluctantly agreed to abandon his flagship and descended a rope ladder to a launch that would take him to the awaiting Nagara vessel. The following morning, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were abandoned and sent to the bottom of the sea. According to military historians, if Lieutenant Best's bomb had missed, the entire course of the battle would have turned, as the Japanese could have dealt a more severe retaliatory attack on the American carriers. The critical American victory at the Midway Atoll is considered the turning point in the Pacific War, halting Japanese expansion and dealing a crushing blow to its naval capabilities, from which the Imperial Japanese Navy never fully recovered. Until October 2019, the location of all but one of the 7 ships sunk during the Battle of Midway, 5 Japanese and 2 American, remained elusive. The research vessel Petrel, with a crew of deep-sea explorers and historians, embarked on a mission to search for the Japanese vessels. Finally, at a depth of approximately 18,011 feet within the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, Hawaii, the team discovered the wreck of Akagi. Reportedly upright and largely intact, the vessel lay resting on its keel. The team confirmed her identity using the identification number and, following a thorough verification process, announced the discovery on October 20th, 2019. A mere 2 days prior, the Petrel team had uncovered the wreck of Kaga, her sister aircraft carrier. Akagi's discovery holds immense significance, offering tangible evidence of a critical moment in World War II history. More than just a long-lost relic of the war, exploring the wreckage site has provided valuable insights into the carrier's design, construction, and battle damage. This newfound knowledge has enabled historians and researchers to construct a more accurate and detailed account of the events that transpired during the more than 80-year-old battle, ensuring that history continues to be written. Utter darkness and a restless sea set the stage for what many historians consider the fiercest and most desperate naval battle, not only of World War II, but of all modern maritime warfare. After the outdated Clemson-class destroyer USS Borie and a modern Kriegsmarine Type 7C U-boat disabled each other's primary weapons in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, the conflict had to be resolved in a more rudimentary way by ramming each other into submission. In the last fateful collision, the 2 belligerent vessels became stuck to each other. The desperate sailors then went up to their respective decks to fire against the enemy forces less than a few yards away. Using handguns and whatever weapon they could manage, the 2 factions battled it out till the end. Steam, fire, and roaring waves engulfed the fighting seamen, and the muzzle flashes and the destroyer's searchlights were the only light sources during the fierce encounter. Meanwhile, another frantic battle was being fought below deck inside USS Borie. As the sailors confronted the Nazi forces above them, the battleship's crew struggled to keep the vessel afloat after the devastating clash had perforated the hull. Time was running out, both ships were highly damaged, and the most savage skirmish continued for an hour until only one ship would be left standing. In November of 1943, the Allied fleets fighting in the Battle of the Atlantic were finally turning the tide. After years of defensive tactics attempting to escort convoys from America to Europe while hoping they would not be targeted by enemy U-boats, they were finally ready to go on the offensive. German U-boats had been running low for some time, and the extraordinary growth and modernization of the Royal Canadian Navy had cornered the Kriegsmarine, making their mission to disrupt supply lines more difficult. The swift production and implementation of American light aircraft carriers had also done wonders to foil further U-boat attacks. Thanks to the air support provided by these units, the days when entire convoys could be obliterated by Nazi offensives were in the past. With the pressure off their backs, the Allied High Command was ready to send some fleets on the offensive. However, the most advanced ships were still to remain as escort units, as keeping up the supply line to Britain continued to be a top priority. Hence, many of the ships sent to search and destroy Nazi submarines weren't exactly top of the class. USS Borie was one of them, a Clemson-class destroyer designed in 1916 and built in 1920. Borie's technology and capabilities were more than outdated. Specifically, a flaw in fantail design meant that the ship could not make tight turns, making her hardly ideal for conducting anti-submarine warfare. Nevertheless, Commander Lieutenant Charles Harris Hutchins and his crew were eager to leave behind the escort duties and venture to hunt down German submarines for the first time. By 1943, 30-year-old Lieutenant Hutchins was the youngest commander of a destroyer in the entire U.S. Navy. After successfully escorting a convoy to Casablanca in June of 1943, Borie was assigned to escort another convoy back west, spearheaded by a light aircraft carrier commanded by Captain Arnold J. Isbell. Soon after the convoy left port, Isbell relayed his plan to Hutchins. They were not just escorting the cargo ships, but actively seeking U-boat concentrations to destroy them. Isbell's decision constituted a drastic change in the Battle of the Atlantic strategy. The idea was to complete their escorting missions, while also setting off the downfall of the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. The novel tactics benefited from the new high-frequency direction-finding sonars equipped into American ships. Nicknamed Huff Duff by the sailors, the new sonar system made the detection and identification of submarine groups more accurate and reliable. In addition, having broken the German Enigma code without them realizing it allowed Allied ships to intercept U-boat transmissions. From then on, Isbell and Hutchins worked together in a specialized unit tasked with only one purpose in mind: to hunt down U-boats before they hunted them. The change in strategy was highly fruitful. In the return trip to Casablanca, the new task force sank up to 6 enemy U-boats while damaging 4 others without suffering any significant damage. The rush of one victory after another could soon be felt in the crews. Then, on October 30th, 1943, the task force encountered a small group of submarines and quickly engaged, sinking one of the vessels before it could submerge. Still, the other 2 escaped. Isbell had a hunch that one of the fleeing U-boats was a milk cow, meaning a larger submarine designed to supply smaller U-boats. Knowing how precious a target such a milk cow was, Isbell wasn't about to let it escape. He then sent USS Borie after the U-boat, and upon learning the news, the crew aboard the American destroyer was ecstatic. Hunting down a prestigious target all by themselves seemed like a thrilling adventure. USS Borie headed for the area of the last contact at sunset, but nothing could have prepared the crew for what awaited them. On November 1st, 1943, as the sun sank beneath the horizon, the sea grew restless, and the lone U.S. destroyer combed the waters in search of furtive submarines. Then, at 1:53 a.m., Borie received a sonar contact. It came from the Kriegsmarine U-405, a Type 7C submarine, a modern iteration of the classic German design. The U-boat crew was experienced, and her highly decorated commander, Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, had sunk numerous Allied ships during his years in the German Navy. As if sensing the tension in the air, the sea grew even wilder, with waves reaching up to 30 feet. The American ship's deck was soaked, and visibility was limited by the restless sea and the night's darkness. Acting before the submarine could react, Borie dropped a set of depth charges. Still, an unfortunate malfunction caused all of her supply to fall simultaneously, leaving the ship without any other submergible explosives. The chain explosion below the waves lifted the destroyer and made the waters rage ferociously around the American ship. As daunting as the explosions were, the crew released a sigh of relief, thinking no submarine could survive the devastation. However, the chained blasts only drew the submarine to the surface, making it unfit to submerge again. As Borie's crew spotted the U-boat, they turned around and began an intense pursuit. The German team then started to fire its anti-aircraft gun at the incoming ship, but Borie's battery was more effective, and after a few precise shots, the submarine's gun was destroyed. The Germans reacted fast and started to turn around in order to direct their torpedo tubes to the side of the American ship. If they could strike the destroyer with one of their powerful torpedoes, they could end the battle right there and then. Hutchins' sharp intuition served him well, and he immediately realized what the Germans were attempting. Borie was crippled by a wider rotating angle, but still managed to turn and avoid the U-boat's bow. As the opportunity arose, Hutchins realized that the best chance to avoid the submarine's torpedoes was to ram her on the side, and hopefully sink her in one mighty blow. Then, as the destroyer approached ramming speeds, she continued to fire upon the German vessel. Commander Hauptmann made a last-ditch attempt to get out of the way before impact, resulting in both ships colliding bow over bow at an angle. Borie penetrated the submarine's hull and became stuck within the ship's frame. The vessels were so close to each other that the destroyer's primary weapon became useless. With the U-boat anti-aircraft gun gone and her torpedoes out of reach, the exhausted crews were now left to fend off by themselves. The noise of cracking steel, gunfire, and desperate shouting invaded the scene. The sailors used every weapon available to them to fight. Sidearms, pistols, and shotguns reversed in case of mutiny. Everything was fair game. It was also reported that the Germans used hand grenades, while a daring American sailor neutralized a Nazi soldier by throwing a knife. Even flare pistols were being fired between them. Meanwhile, another life-or-death struggle was taking place below the decks of the American destroyer. One of the submarine's diving tails had punctured Borie's hull during the impact, and the engine rooms quickly flooded. The crew desperately tried to halt the flood by blocking the breach with mattresses and anything they could find, but the engine room staff were half submerged by then. Still, one of the engines remained active, and the turbine continued to operate for a while. After 10 excruciating minutes, the U-boat freed herself from the destroyer and quickly turned to aim her torpedoes at Borie. The crew then fired, but missed the ship. Back on the American vessel, the main gun was usable again, and it started to rain hell all around the German submarine. The U-boat responded by trying to escape. Hutchins decided that the best course of action was to let the Nazis think they would let them go, and then turned off the searchlights while following the damaged U-boat using the sonar. Borie's lights were turned on again as she reached her objective, and the battle resumed. The submarine then fired another torpedo, just to have it miss again. In turn, the destroyer responded by firing her last depth charges from a side-mounted gun, with the explosives damaging the U-boat even further. The last offensive attempt by the Nazis was to try to ram the destroyer. But as the submarine drew close, Borie's main gun finally struck true, disabling the engine. The submarine leapt from the water and came just a few yards from the Americans. Now totally unfunctional, the submarine became an easy target for the American destroyer, and before the Nazi commander could reignite the engine, Borie's main gun hit the rear exhaust port. The few remaining German sailors finally surrendered, and a few minutes later, at 2:53 a.m., the U-405 sank and exploded below the water. Hutchins would later recall the moment, quote, "When the submarine sank, there was a yell that went up from all hands. It probably could be heard in Berlin." The victory was decisive. No German sailors survived, while only a few American casualties occurred. However, Borie was damaged beyond repair and was still sinking fast. A few hours later, Hutchins ordered his crew to abandon the ship before scuttling it. The sailors, still in high spirits, awaited rescue aboard their lifeboats. Hutchins would eventually receive the Navy Cross for his bravery, but most importantly, his efforts would be engraved in history as the beginning of the end of Germany's U-boat supremacy. The Japanese forces were completely surrounded. The brutal Battle of Tassafaranga in November of 1942 had left them in an increasingly precarious position, and the men at Guadalcanal knew that continuing to defend the island was futile. As the U.S. Marines and Navy got closer, the Japanese had to choose between fighting to the last man or retreating in a desperate attempt to see another day. It was then that the Imperial High Command asked Emperor Hirohito for a complete withdrawal. The plea was heard, and soon the Japanese launched Operation K, a massive and ambitious plan to save as many soldiers as possible while being entirely overpowered by air and sea. More than 10,000 men were the target, and the only way to do it was right under the noses of American forces ruthlessly attacking them. 8 months after the Pearl Harbor attack in 1941, the 1st Division of the U.S. Marine Corps was finally ready for payback. Supported by naval and air bombardments, the Leathernecks landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the Eastern Solomons on August 7, 1942, to the complete shock of the Japanese. The objective was to deny the enemy the use of local bases that would threaten Allied supply routes. The following day, the Marines captured Tulagi and the Japanese airfield at Lunga Point, which they would later rename Henderson Field. From this base, the Allied Cactus Air Force would operate from August to December of 1942. However, the Japanese forces quickly retaliated while the Marines celebrated their anticipated victory, and at the Battle of Savo Island, the Imperial Japanese Navy undertook a night surface attack that almost annihilated the American Navy ships that had supported the U.S. landings. It would become the worst defeat of a single fleet in U.S. Navy history, and for the following months, the battle for Guadalcanal raged on between the Marines and the Japanese soldiers. Both sides struggled without additional troops and resources, but the Americans were eventually resupplied. With their increased presence on land and sea, the Japanese transport ships could not deliver men and goods, as they were repeatedly assaulted by the Cactus Air Force operating from within Guadalcanal. On October 11th, during the Battle of Cape Esperance, the Imperial Navy dispatched a task force of heavy cruisers and destroyers to protect a significant supply and reinforcement convoy. A relentless battle then broke out in the middle of the night after the U.S. Navy spotted the Japanese and obstructed their supply operation. Still, the Japanese fought valiantly and recaptured Henderson Field, but morale quickly began to diminish without proper supplies and fresh reinforcements. Throughout the rest of November, the Americans and Japanese engaged with each other in multiple naval and land encounters, and the Imperial Navy delivered 7,000 soldiers and supplies in a third and last effort to retake Henderson Field and destroy the Cactus Air Force. They ultimately failed, and the famine spread swiftly among the ranks. Malnutrition, coupled with a lack of ammunition and troops, quickly reduced the enemy's combat effectiveness. After the Allied forces attacked the occupied Bunagona, the Japanese Combined Fleet naval leaders concluded that New Guinea posed a more significant threat to the security of the empire than the American presence at Guadalcanal. During a reunion at the Army headquarters in Tokyo, Major General Kenryo Sato, the War Ministry's chief of its Military Affairs Bureau, suggested to Prime Minister General Hideki Tojo that withdrawal from the island was inevitable. Quote, "We have no choice. Even now it may be too late. If we go on like this, we have no chance of winning the war." Emperor Hirohito was still committed to sending 95,000 tons of supplies to the starving troops at Guadalcanal, but after 4 months of gruesome combat under the burning sun and the tropical diseases, the realities of the costly campaign to push back the U.S. forces began to sink in. On December 23rd, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, the commander of the 17th Japanese Army on Guadalcanal, wrote, quote, "No food available, and we can no longer send out scouts. We can do nothing to withstand the enemy's offensive. 17th Army now request permission to break into the enemy's positions and die an honorable death rather than die of hunger in our own dugouts." The Imperial Navy blamed the Army for such a desperate situation, arguing that the Army did not effectively use the men and equipment given. Meanwhile, the Army blamed the Navy for not supplying enough food and ammunition for the soldiers. After 4 days of meaningless discussion, it was agreed that Guadalcanal could not be recaptured. Then, on December 28th, General Hajime Sugiyama and Admiral Osami Nagano informed Emperor Hirohito of the intended withdrawal. He would finally agree 2 days later. In early January of 1943, the Combined Fleet and the 8th Area Army put together Operation K, the evacuation of Guadalcanal's malnourished garrison. The plan was divided into 2 phases. The first called for an army battalion to land with supplies on Guadalcanal around January 14th and act as the rearguard for the evacuation. The second phase would begin with the withdrawal of the 17th Army to the western section of Guadalcanal around January 26th. Meanwhile, the Imperial Navy would launch an air and sea superiority campaign around the southern Solomon Islands to distract the Allied forces from a false offensive. In addition, Port Darwin, Australia, the Marshall Islands, and other locations would be assaulted to further increase the confusion. These deceptive operations would be accompanied by false radio traffic to fool the Americans into thinking that another offensive was imminent. These maneuvers would allow the 17th Army survivors to be picked up in 3 lifts by destroyers, and submarines would pick up the soldiers left behind. If everything went accordingly, Operation K would end by February 10th. The Japanese transports continued their supply runs during the first days of January. Then, on the 14th, 9 destroyers delivered the Yano Battalion, the contingent of 750 men under the command of Major K.G. Yano that would serve as the rear guard. Accompanying Yano was Lieutenant Colonel Kumayo Imoto, who was tasked with delivering withdrawal orders to General Hyakutake. During the first minutes of their walk through the silent jungle in the middle of the night, the men from Yano's contingent were met with a harsh dose of reality. Bodies of deceased Japanese soldiers were everywhere. Imoto would later write, quote, "The trail that led to 17th Army headquarters was a trail of corpses." When the details of Operation K were given to General Hyakutake, he felt both relief and shame. He wanted to go down in combat, but also wished to live to see his men survive. Quote, "It is a very difficult task for the Army to withdraw under existing circumstances. However, the orders of the area army, based upon orders of the Emperor, must be carried out at any cost. I cannot guarantee it can be completely carried out." Sacrifices had to be made, and all the troops left behind were encouraged to take their own lives to honor the Empire instead of surrendering. The 38th Division was the first to disengage and withdraw towards Camp Esperance. Still, many men were left behind while giving ground to the American forces they were fighting. The withdrawal of the 38th was covered by Yano's contingent, while the 2nd Division desperately evacuated Kokumbona before the American 25th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army encircled them. Soon, Japanese units were left behind and fought to the last man to protect their comrades. By January 23rd, the U.S. had captured Kokumbona, and 3 days later, the Army and Marine units attempted to halt the advance of the retreating Japanese. Still, they were stopped by the Yano Battalion at the Marmara River. On January 29th, Yano retreated across the Bonegi River, and the Japanese 2nd Division held its ground for over 3 days before shore bombardments from U.S. destroyers forced them to get on the move. Meanwhile, hellish firefights took place over the skies of Guadalcanal, with American and Japanese dogfights trying to support their ground units. As this happened, a U.S. Navy task force confronted 2 Japanese air groups near Rennell Island at sea, and the Chicago cruiser was hit by 2 torpedoes and sunk. Wichita and Louisville were also hit, but kept the fighting formation. By February 2nd, most of the Japanese garrison had made it to the western sector, and the Imperial Navy gathered its task force to begin the extraction. The U.S. forces believed that the enemy was reinforcing the island and mobilized men and ships, but it was too late. Japanese Val attack aircraft sank the destroyer USS De Haven and damaged the USS Nicholas, while the first evacuation run was in progress. After boarding about 4,900 men from the 38th Division, the enemy transport destroyers departed and left the battle zone. The second evacuation run took place on February 4th. With more American units making their way to the west, the retreat was more difficult, but Yano's battalion resisted at the Segilao River. The evacuation began at 11:30 a.m. as 20 Japanese destroyers fought against 74 enemy aircraft and dozens of U.S. Navy PT boats. An hour later, Hyakutake and 3,900 men from the 2nd Division were extracted. The American forces kept advancing every night until the less than 2,000 Japanese soldiers that remained were almost entirely surrounded, and the last evacuation group arrived at 12:03 a.m. on February 8th to take those remaining soldiers, including Yano's men. By 1:32 a.m., Operation K had finished with considerable success. About 600 Japanese soldiers lost their lives, and about 3,000 were injured, but more than 10,000 had been extracted. Still, the American forces never knew it was a withdrawal until they noticed there was not a single Japanese survivor left on the island.